By definition, wars represent an interruption of the natural order of things. But World War II was unique in terms of the scale of its devastation, the global radius of its destruction, the level of civilian suffering, and the brutal degree to which military might pursued ideological vision. From Tokyo and Manila to Warsaw and Coventry, this war churned cities of life into desolate piles of rubble. In the process, the conflict rattled the pillars of the previous world order, scarred contemporaries, and ensured that a new international system would emerge in its destructive wake. World War II did not emerge in a vacuum. In fact, the conflict was the culmination of the breakdown of the previous world system. World War II served as the exclamation point for the crisis of the 1930s. The preceding world order collapsed from unsteady foundations. During the late 19th century, Europe's great powers had expanded their influence across the globe, incorporating most of the non-Western world inside a Western-dominated world system. European conquest had dramatically restructured local life, while continued economic exploitation had stimulated a rising tide of resentment, as colonial nationalists demanded reform and freedom. The most prevalent ideology during the early 20th century was social Darwinism. Statesmen of all stripes and nationalities applied Darwin's theory of evolution to international relations. According to this view, states were the culmination of the national character. The world was a hostile jungle, and weaker races were slated for extinction. This dark and cynical view of human development will lead fascists to reject liberal concepts, international law, and democracy in favor of a militant nationalism that looked upon neighbors as enemies to be conquered and subjugated. Third pillar of the previous world order was the Great Depression. The Great Depression represented a global breakdown of the world economy. Ordinary people could not find work. They lost their homes, and they struggled to feed their families. As this decade-long recession dragged people down into misery, they lost faith in parliamentary democracy, technological progress, and laissez-faire capitalism, leading people towards extremist doctrines like fascism that promised to restore order, sanity, and meaning to life. Finally, World War II was a child of the Versailles Settlement. In 1919, President Wilson had promised to banish the scourge of war. But by the 1930s, it was clear that his dream for liberal internationalism had failed. Rather than a grand settlement to end the scourge of war, Versailles had alienated Germany, Italy, and Japan and set the stage for... All wars are unique in their own peculiar way. But in the annals of human history, World War II was unprecedented in terms of its savagery and destructiveness. One feature that set World War II apart was total war. The degree to which belligerent states mobilized their peoples and resources towards the war effort. In Canada, children were recruited to recycle cans for armaments production. Women were invited onto the factory floor to replace men called into service, and grandmothers were exhorted to grow victory gardens. Mobilization of ordinary citizens transformed them into soldiers out of uniform, fighting on the home front. Another feature of World War II was the scale of the devastation. Mobilization of the internal combustion engine, particularly in airplanes, spread the fighting hundreds of miles behind front lines. Newly emergent doctrines of strategic warfare called for leveling enemy bridges, rail yards, factories, and dams. Cities emerged as battlefronts, as their ruins provided soldiers cover from high explosives. In Tokyo and Warsaw, 90% of the housing stock was destroyed during the war. Berlin, Hamburg, London, and Manila also suffered substantial damage. World War I had been global primarily in the sense that the great powers were empires that tried to mobilize colonial resources for victory in Europe. But fighting was mostly confined to the trenches of France and Belgium and the Carpathian Mountains. World War II, in contrast, contained two major battlefronts, Europe and the Pacific Rim, while North Africa was also ravaged by the war. Hundreds of millions of civilians witnessed fighting, endured aerial bombardment, dealt with malnourishment, or suffered enemy occupation. World War II was provoked by the Axis powers that were fascist states that glorified violence as a sublime expression of vigor, and who saw war as a manifestation of racial struggle. Fascism translated into war in a new key. The Axis powers dehumanized their opponents. They deployed battlefield weapons to terrorize enemy civilians, and their occupation regimes plundered their neighbors' resources to the point of causing starvation. Finally, the feature that most sets World War II apart was the idea and index of civilian suffering. World War I was an infantryman's war, and the most typical casualty was a young man in the trenches. But during World War II, civilians were not spared combat. Cities were transformed into battlefields. Aerial bombardment targeted homes and infrastructure, and occupied peoples were targeted for persecution, subjugation, even extermination. As a result, the unarmed civilian represented World War II's most typical casualty. Over 15 million Russian and Chinese civilians perished. The Jews were targeted for extermination, and across the world, civilians emerged in 1945 exhausted, emaciated, and suffering from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress syndrome. Contemporary Canadians often remember World War II as a good war. To understand how this conflict scarred contemporaries, we can chronicle some of its most brutal atrocities. When Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, he told his generals this was not a typical conflict, but a Vernichtingskrieg, or war of annihilation. What he meant is that he intended not merely to defeat Stalin, but to plunder the Soviet Union, depopulate European Russia, and resettle ethnic Germans there. Annihilation War represented the culmination of the fascist reformulation of social Darwinism and dramatically expanded the scope of war by removing traditional restraints on targeting unarmed civilians. In this way, atrocity was implicit in the fascist philosophy of war and ensured a dramatic increase in the level of civilian suffering. The most infamous atrocity of World War II was the Holocaust, where the Nazis created an elaborate machinery to exterminate the Jews as a race. The photo on the left depicts the Einsatzgruppen, special task forces that followed behind the German army and proceeded with pacification duties. Typically, they would roll into a Jewish neighborhood or village and order its residents to dig a pit. Once done, the Jews would be instructed to stand at the lip while the Germans shot and machine gunned them down, allowing gravity to pull them into the pit for easy disposal. Unfortunately, the Axis states did not have a monopoly on civilian atrocities. The Western Allies, who had been pushed from Europe, developed the concept of strategic bombing as a way to bring the fight to the enemy. Originally, the idea was to target enemy factories and infrastructure, to impede their war effort in armaments factories. Quickly, the Allied strategy broadened to include saturation bombing. At Dresden, during a 3-day raid in 1945, over 100,000 civilians died. Many died in bomb shelters, as the fires raged so furiously and hot that it quite literally sucked oxygen from their lungs. The Allies used incendiary bombs that contained white phosphorus. This could leach through the concrete into air raid shelters. If it landed on your hand, you couldn't douse it with water. You had to take care that when it burnt through your skin, it didn't seep onto your foot. Arguably the most savage atrocity was the rape of Nanking. After the Chinese resisted the Japanese invitation to join their empire, angry Japanese troops pulled into the Chinese capital and went on a 4-month rampage, raping, looting, and torturing civilians. The rank and file of the army not only participated in a mayhem that killed over 200,000 defenseless civilians, but seemed to take sadistic pleasure in developing new ways of torturing their victims, from raping women before their husbands to mutilating their breasts. The battle for Berlin represented the climax of Hitler's brutal race war. The tables had turned by 1945. And as the Red Army pulled into Berlin, they understood that they had arrived at the capital from which Hitler had given the order to slaughter their brothers, sons, and mothers. As they fought their way into Hitler's bunker, no quarter was given or expected. It is estimated that over 200,000 German women and girls were raped in the brutal final week of fighting, the majority of them gang raped on multiple occasions. While Stalin would join the anti-fascist alliance, he started the war as Hitler's ally, collaborating in the conquest of Poland. Soviet policy in occupied Poland from 1939 to 1941 was remarkably similar to that of the Nazis. The Russian secret police arrested the Polish elite, politicians, cultural figures, and military officers. And in the Katyn forest executed nearly 20,000 of them, throwing their body into improvised pits with the idea that decapitating the Polish intelligentsia would make the population as a whole more docile. On August 2, 1945, the world entered the nuclear age. Fat Boy detonated over a Japanese hospital, instantly incinerating about 40,000 people in the city center. As the photo on the right demonstrates, The shock wave leveled all but stone structures. But the majority of Japanese lived in bamboo and rice paper dwellings. Within a week, another 30,000 people were estimated to have perished from their wounds and radiation poisoning. The U.S. objective was to convince the defeated Japanese to surrender. But this was a weapon of mass destruction, guaranteed to induce widespread and indiscriminate civilian slaughter. By surveying World War II's various atrocities, we get a better sense of how this war left its dark imprint upon civilians across the world. First of all, World War II represented war in a new key. Fascist doctrines wrote civilian terrorism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide into the conflict's DNA. The fascist powers in particular mistreated prisoners of war, most famously in 1941, when Nazi Germany starved over 1 million Russian POWs to death. Across the globe, mass murder of civilians became a staple feature of this war, either by marauding armies or by aerial bombardment. The racial doctrines propelling the fascist powers translated into tremendous suffering for the hundreds of millions of civilians occupied by the Axis during the war. While the Holocaust is the most remembered atrocity of World War II, the mistreatment of peoples because of their ethnic background and the racial characteristics ascribed to them was a broader feature of World War II. Another feature driving civilian suffering was total war mobilization. Canadians were mostly insulated from direct contact in the war, but life was hardly a picnic inside belligerent states that were fortunate to escape enemy occupation. Many people were left homeless by the war. New strategic doctrines resulted in massive disruption of civilian life, as rail yards, power plants, bridges, and dams were targeted and leveled. Retooling of national resources for the war effort resulted in rationing and consumer shortages for sugar, coffee, and chocolate. Canadians were relatively fortunate in comparison to the millions that literally starved to death in Bengal and Vietnam. Living under fascist occupation was miserable, but even in the non-Western states, civil rights were suspended. Britain was fighting for its survival, and for soldiers fighting on the home front, this meant long hours of work for miserable wages. Throughout the world, civilian life was disrupted. For example, women had to assume new roles by replacing men in factories after they were called away for service. Arguably, the most defining aspect of World War II was the occupation experience. This included millions of prisoners of war, subjected to often harsh enemy rules and brutal summary justice. It included people occupied by the fascist states who had their resources requisitioned. Throughout the world, survivors emerged emaciated and hungry as farms lay abandoned, while ruined infrastructure disrupted traditional food distribution networks. Not only soldiers, but civilians emerged from the war scarred for life, suffering from nightmares and undiagnosed post-traumatic stress syndrome that they often treated with heavy doses of alcohol. Finally, the emaciated victims that emerged from German and Japanese camps. They might breathe a sigh of relief, but many like Otto Frank would soon come to the harrowing realization that their entire extended family had perished. Such examples illustrate the most extreme case of a typical post-war reality. It would not be easy to put the war behind, start life over again, or support the ideas that might have seemed reasonable before the conflict broke out. World War II had raged across the global stage. It had pushed ordinary people beyond normal limits, it had laid cities to ruin, and it left permanent scars on the souls of survivors. For more destructive sequel conflict.